Okay, so we're going through the plan of redemption, again, looking at it from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, not covering every chapter, just really looking at the plan of redemption in really kind of big chunks on how it looks in Scripture, because so many people, they see the cross as an afterthought. Some people believe that Christ is not the Son of God, but rather he was a created being, specifically created for the redemption of man after the fall in the garden. So we've been going through that, and last week we were talking, we started off their year in Sinai. So they've left Egypt, they're in Sinai for a year. We discussed the giving of the law that is there. There's really four kind of basic things that happen at Sinai: that the law is given, the pattern of the tabernacle is disclosed, the tabernacle is constructed, the pattern for the priesthood and the sacrificial system is implemented, and the nation is numbered and organized. And so we looked at the giving of the law last week, and we're coming into the tabernacle this week. So we're looking at the implications of the tabernacle. In Exodus chapter 32 through 34. So we started off, we're in Exodus 32 through 34 this morning. We see Israel worshiping and dancing before the golden calf while Moses was high atop the mount, Mount Sinai, in the presence of God. Now, the symbolism behind the golden calf is actually, hotly debated, because we often look at the golden calf as what? As an idol, right? A false idol, a false god. After all, these were people who had come out of Egypt, who they themselves had worshipped idols while there. But there's some debate over it, in that wasn't necessarily the case, because many people find that it's unlikely that Aaron intended for it to represent another deity, because when he fashioned it, if you are there in Exodus 32, you'll notice in verse 5, he said, this is after building the golden calf, Aaron declares, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." Now, is that Lord in upper or lowercase in your Bible? Upper. Right, that's uppercase. He's talking about Yahweh. He's not talking about a false god or an idol. So he's built this, and remember, he didn't initially want to build it either. But he said, if we look at the original Hebrew, it says that the people were pressing against him. It isn't just that they were saying, "Hey, Aaron, do you mind, just building us a golden calf or anything?" Is that they were threatening him. It was a gang mentality, and he felt that his life was in danger. So he has them bring the gold, and he fashions this, and it wasn't an overnight thing. I mean, you think you have this huge population of people. They're bringing their gold bracelets and earrings and necklaces and headwear, then you have to get the fire hot enough for it to be melted down. You've got to pour it at least into sheets, right, to overlay something with the gold, and you can't just pour it on the ground. And so that's, you've got to have some stone cuttings or something, because even if you pour it on a flat stone, well, the melted gold is just going to run off the side. So they had to fashion a mold there as well. So it wasn't an overnight process. And when he's done, he says, "Tomorrow shall be a feast for the Lord." And it's also suggested that the people didn't think that it was another deity either. That they weren't looking to worship another deity either. And the reason, if you're there in Exodus 32, so you saw what Aaron proclaimed in verse 5, but look at verse 4. "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Right? But who did the people think brought them out of the land of Egypt?
Moses.
They thought it was Moses. And I'll give you a couple of references for that. Exodus chapter 14 and verse 11. Exodus 14 verse 11. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 3. And Exodus chapter 17 and verse 3. Now the people, they were not ignorant of God's prohibition against making this false idol. Because you think back to Exodus 20. Exodus 20, what happens there? That's the giving of what? Right, the Ten Commandments. And you have the commandment, that commandment that you are the second one, that you're not to make any graven image of anything in heaven or on earth or under the earth, and you're not to bow down and worship them. And you have later on that the people, Moses, he declares this to the people, that they say everything that God says to do, we're going to do. So they weren't ignorant of it. And you have Aaron saying, okay, tomorrow we're going to have a feast to Yahweh. And the people are saying, this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. And so what most tend to believe is that they weren't looking at it as an idol, but they wanted more of an intermediary like Moses was. Because see, you had God, right? And then Moses, God's mouthpiece, if you will, speaking to the people, leading the people, and what have you. And so when the people then say, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt, it was more of a, this is replacing Moses. Because remember, they didn't know what was happening to Moses. He's up there for 40 days. And there's the lightning, and there's the thunder, and there's the clouds of smoke. They have no idea what's going on. So most people tend to believe that it wasn't an idol that they were trying to do, but that they were actually they weren't trying to replace God, they were trying to replace Moses. So that's kind of an interesting thing. You can take it for what it is. I certainly, if you have questions about it, to go back and study the language in those couple of verses and what's going on, and look at some commentaries. Now, of course, commentaries aren't inspired, but they can give you, some more insight, right?
You said they treated it like it was Yahweh, but in 32:4 it says, Israel, hear your God, and little. So,
yeah.
Did they treat him as
Moses?
God, or did they treat him as God?
Well, is that because they looked at Moses in the whole process, like God chose Moses, right, to be his mouthpiece and to lead the people. And Moses, he starts making his excuses. Who am I? I'm not a good speaker, blah, blah, blah. So he sends Aaron with him. And even Moses said, God has sent me to lead you out of Egypt. But the people never recognized God's authority. They only saw the man. They only saw Moses. And so some rabbinic scholars believe that the Jewish people at the time treated Moses like a god because of everything that they saw Moses do. They didn't see God do it. They didn't see it as God doing it. They saw it as Moses doing it.
Catholics replaced Moses.
Right.
Worship God.
Right. And Aaron never intended that because of verse 5. He's like, tomorrow we're going to have a feast to Yahweh. So it's kind of like, if we're replacing Yahweh, then why would we have a feast for him? That type of thing. Good question, though. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
In verse 4, he talked about saying little gods, but that gods is also plural in verse 4. It kind of made me wonder if it's not also speaking, do you say with Moses, if not Aaron and Miriam might have been somewhere in there, because in Numbers, it came a little later, both of them were saying, hey, why is Moses such a big deal? God's spoken through us too,
Yeah.
Is Aaron making a god of himself?
Well, it was the people who say, these are your gods. But the crux of the issue there is that when it's saying they proclaim or what have you, is that it's not saying that the they is inclusive of Aaron. Most people tend to doubt it, though, because when Moses comes down off the mount, Aaron, he's really apologetic, and he's like, look, you know these people, okay? You know what I've had to deal with, But yeah. It is kind of interesting, though, because there are people today who they look not at God, but they look at the man, you know. And I'm not even talking miracles or anything like that. It is, you know, that they can look at a man and see what he's done and not think anything about, well, he's got God on his side, you know, that type of thing. So we have that, and there's 13 chapters that are dedicated to the tabernacle and the priesthood. 9 are for the pattern and the construction of the tabernacle. 2 for the clothing and apparel of the priest. 1 is for the consecration of the priest, and 1 to the setting in place of the tabernacle. So positioned in front of the tabernacle, separated from it by only the laver. The laver is a large basin of water. Okay, so you've got you've got this public space, and you have an altar there, and then you have this basin of water, and then you've got the tabernacle, right? So you've got this altar of sacrifice. Rivers of animal blood would just flow from it because the number of sacrifices needing to be made. And every drop of blood looked back really to the entrance of sin there in Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, and the promise of redemption in Genesis 3 and verse 15, where the Lord is speaking and he says, you know, to the woman, you're going to have, or to the serpent, rather, that you will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head, and that it's going to come, that redemption is going to come from the seed of the woman. And then Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, where there's the Abrahamic covenant. And so all of these sacrifices, they're looking back to the entrance of sin and the promise of redemption, and they're looking all the way forward to Calvary and to the cross of Christ. The blood itself was a continual reminder of the holiness of God, the nature of sin, man's spiritual decay, and the necessity of grace. So that's it. It's a continual reminder. The holiness of God, the nature of sin, man's spiritual decay, and the necessity of grace. All the people had access to the altar. Okay? The altar, it was out there in this kind of public area. Everybody had access to it, right? And at times, the horns of the altar were a refuge for people. You know, there's a design really kind of behind everything. Over in Exodus 21, verses 13 and 14, God speaks about appointing a place for a man to flee, and he calls it my altar. He tells him there, I'm going to tell you a place. If a man does this, killing another man, if a man does this, I'm going to appoint a place where he can flee. And he says, and he uses the term my altar in there. Now in 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 50, we have an example of Adonijah. Adonijah is Solomon's brother, and he thought he should have been king. But, well, who ended up being king? Not a trick question. Solomon in this case. Yeah, King David, yeah. But Solomon. And so Adonijah, he feared Solomon. And so what he does is he runs to the altar and grabs a hold of one of the horns. It was a place of refuge, and he wouldn't leave it until Solomon promised not to hurt him, not to have him killed. And so that there's an example there. And so it says there in 1 Kings 1:50, and Adonijah, Solomon's brother, feared Solomon, so he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. In his time of distress, in Adonijah's time of distress, he ran to the Lord and he sought his protection from certain death. Does that not serve as an example for all people? The face of certain spiritual death And what should people be doing? They should be running to the Lord. They should be running and taking hold of it.
Is that what we call it, an altar call?
I'm not sure why they call it an altar call. I don't know. Other than the fact that, that might be because of the Roman Catholicism and the altars and everything that were out there. I don't know though. That's interesting. And when we look to the New Testament, we see the altar symbolized in the cross of Christ over in Hebrews 13, verses 10 through 12. It's not all up there, but Hebrews 13, 10 through 12, we have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. Now, he's talking about those who are still serving the old Mosaic law. They have no right. You can't mix the two laws together, right? The old law has been done away with. So he's saying there that we have an altar from which those who are serving the tent, those who are still practicing and living the Mosaic law, they have no right to eat of it. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. So you think of him being led out of Jerusalem, so going out of the gate, out of the camp, so to speak. And so Jesus also suffered outside the gate to sanctify the people through his own blood. So simply put, when we use the term grab hold of the horns of the altar, that means that we go to God with all of our hearts. We cry out for mercy based on the result of what Jesus has done or did do when he died on the cross. We plead our case before God until we receive it. Think of Adonijah. He didn't run to another man for protection. He didn't run to a big army or to another king or anything like that. He ran to God because he knew that ultimately God's the only one that can save him. And he grabbed a hold of it and he was pleading for mercy. I'm not leaving here. You can almost picture Adonijah saying or doing something like that. Having the horns of the altar, and he's like, I'm not leaving here until I know that I'm saved. I'm not leaving until I know that I am protected. And so in the same way, people in their distress, and I would say even Christians, because coming to the Lord isn't just something that non-Christians do. Christians need to come to the Lord even I would say, even more frequently. Because we know what it is that we have, right? And so is that we go to the Lord in our times of distress, in our times of need. Not just distress, our times of need and times of joy. And we hold on to that and we cling to that. It's like, I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving until I know that I am right with God. I'm not going anywhere until I know that in New Testament and modern vernacular, until I know that I'm saved, until I know that everything is okay. Right? This is the place where God interacts with people based on what Jesus has done. Now, the most holy place of the tabernacle. Well, any thoughts or questions or comments? Thoughts, questions, comments? Those might all just be synonyms of the same thing. I'm not really sure. English was never my strong suit. Okay, nothing. So the most holy place of the tabernacle, it contained the Ark of the Covenant. All right. The top of that chest was pure gold with a golden cherub at each end, and was called the mercy seat. Now, a cherub, if you don't know, is an angelic being with either human, animal, or bird-like attributes, and they serve as the throne bearers of God. They're associated with the worship and praise of God. In fact, they're introduced in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 24 after Adam and Eve are cast out of the Garden of Eden, is that there is cherubim that are placed there with flaming swords to protect the way, right? or to guard against entry. Satan was a cherub. Ezekiel, you might want to jot down Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 15. Ezekiel 28, verses 12 through 15, talking about him being in the garden and talking about a little bit about how he looked and calls him a cherub. Cherubim is just the plural form of cherub. Cherubim, while angelic beings, they're not the same as a seraphim, which is another angelic being. And you can see them in Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Isaiah 6, 1 through 3. And if you want a little bit more of a description of cherubs, you can look at Ezekiel chapter 1, if you just happen to be interested. It's when you get to Revelation and you start hearing descriptions of angels, that's where things get a little bit crazy. So on the Day of Atonement, so we've got the Ark of the Covenant, we have the two cherubs there, and we have the mercy seat. And on the Day of the Atonement, the high priest sprinkled animal blood on the mercy seat to atone for the sins of Israel. Now, if you want to know more about the Day of Atonement, that's Leviticus chapter 16. Okay? Leviticus chapter 16. This is where the Lord would meet with Moses. Exodus 25 and verse 22. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the Ark of the Testimony. Also, the Ark of the Testimony, or Ark of the Covenant, same thing. I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. So now, the tabernacle, with its priesthood and divinely appointed activities, from the sacrifices to how people are entering in and what have you, they really depict the significance of entering God's presence for worship and fellowship. The distance between God's holiness and man's sin cannot be measured. We cannot fathom how far sin puts us away from God. And God is so holy that he cannot look on sin with approval. That's Habakkuk 1 and verse 13. What's interesting is that most translations say that you cannot look upon sin, right? So some people take that literally. No, it's not that God can't look upon sin, because then he wouldn't be able to see sinful people and what have you. It's that God cannot look upon sin with approval. He can't look at someone committing evil and be like, yeah, that's okay. Do your thing, right? And, make yourself happy and all of that. He can't do that. It's completely against who he is. So sin distances us greatly in ways that we cannot even imagine. And so when it comes to worship, and we have this model here with the tabernacle, the actions of the priests, and what's going on. The purpose of worship is not for man to get in touch with his inner feelings. Okay, that's not the purpose of worship. It's not to appease the conscience. It's not to make people feel good about themselves. It's not to satisfy the flesh. It's not to just entertain someone's emotions, despite what many worship services are like today. Worship is not the place for experimentation or theater or dramatics. I've seen people, and I've mentioned it before, they'll have a congregational kind of saying or whatever, and they'll say, it's all about God. And next thing you know, the preacher is flying in on a zip line. At one time, I guess maybe God got him back or something, because when he got about 20 foot away from the stage, he was still hanging in the air and they couldn't get him down. That's what you get. So it's not to make us feel good. It's not about, satisfying our desires, our emotions, our wants. The purpose of worship is to honor and glorify God. God is the object of our worship. That's all it ever has been. From the Old Testament forward, it has always been to honor and glorify God, not for Mike to get what Mike wants out of it. I remember hearing a story one time, and this woman, she came up to the minister after services, and she said, you know, I really didn't get anything out of the worship today. And he kind of looked at her and he just said, that's okay, it wasn't for you. You know? It's not about what you or I get out of worship. Sure, if there's a point in the lesson or something that speaks to us, you know, ultimately it should be God's Word that we look at. It shouldn't be, you know, and y'all have heard me say this before. Greatest compliment a preacher can receive is not, man, that was a great sermon. It's people walking out of the building saying, man, we have such a great God. It's seeing and glorifying God. That's what it's for. You know? That's what we're all trying to achieve, is honoring and glorifying God. If we get something out of it, sure, it's a side benefit, but we should not be the main focus. And sometimes we have to ask, if you're one of those people who says, I didn't get anything out of the worship today, ask yourself this: what did I bring to the worship? Not what did I do? Not well, I didn't say a prayer, I didn't read a scripture, not that. But what was your mindset when you came into worship? Where was your heart when you came to worship God? And we're gonna see this here in just a minute, since apparently I'm going faster than I thought. Any questions or comments though? Okay. So just look at this real quick. Acts chapter 10, verses 25 and 26. Now, Acts chapter 10, we know that's Cornelius. That is when the Gentiles are really grafted in to this faith. Acts chapter 10, verses 25 and 26. Cornelius, he received this vision. He sent for Peter. Peter shows up at his house. And when Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. But Peter lifted him up, saying, stand up, I too am a man. Okay? Now, turn over to Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19, verses 9 and 10. And the angel said to me, write this. Remember, this is John, right? He's vanished to the island of Patmos. And he is in the Spirit on the Lord's day. We read that in chapter 1. And we get to chapter 19, verse 9 and 10. And the angel said to me, write this. Blessed are those who were invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. Then I fell down at his feet to worship him. But he said to me, you must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God. For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Okay? One last reference, I'll just give it to you, you don't have to turn there, but Jesus in the wilderness, when he's fasting and he's being tested, right? At the beginning, before he actually officially starts his ministry, he said, it is written there in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 10, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Question. Reading these things in Scripture, how many today bow down either literally or with their hearts, emotionally and mentally, to worship man and not God? You know? How many people that they don't, how often have you heard maybe someone, y'all should come worship with us. I mean, we've got all of these great programs. We have, 3 or 4 events a week. We do all of this type of stuff and everything. But they never mention, You know what? How about you worship with us? We strive to worship God according to the Bible. We want to worship God and God alone. Yeah, we have these other things, but really those things aren't as important as pleasing God is. How many times have we invited someone to services and not mentioned God at all? It's about maybe we have this or that, or we've got this going on, or whatever. You know? By the way, as a side note, the current custom of Roman Catholics is to bow down to the Pope when they meet him. For centuries, it was that you would bow down to the Pope and you would kiss his feet. And now it's a matter of you would bow down and kiss what's called the papal ring if you meet him. You know how someone is false? You don't have to know all of their doctrine to just say, Jesus said don't bow down and worship anybody. You have to be some type of crazy to do something that even an angel would not want you to do. You know? John is bowing down to worship an angel, and the angel's like, nope, nope, you need to stand up. Don't you do that. You need to worship God, and you need to worship Him alone. Yeah. And yet you have people every Sunday, you know, going in, they'll kneel down and kiss the feet of a statue, or, you know, when meeting the Pope, they'll bow down to him. And why do that? Because according to Roman Catholicism, and this is what I'll say because I'm not trying to get off on a tangent, because according to Roman Catholicism, he is the spiritual representative of Christ and Christ's church for the whole earth. You know, through the lineage of Peter and all that type of stuff.
You can't get much more spiritual than an angel.
Yeah, really. I mean, he is, John is in the Spirit on the Lord's day. He's seeing this vision. This is an angelic being who has been in the presence of God. I mean, granted, Jesus saying it in Matthew should have been enough. You know, God setting the pattern in the Old Testament should have been enough. But you have an angelic being saying, don't do that, and yet people still do that and think that it's okay. Thoughts or comments? Okay, 5 minutes. Oh, go ahead. Yes, no?
Oh. I was gonna say.
You're killing me, Pam.
I know, I always do. There's a fine difference between teaching and preaching, and I think you start preaching sometimes, which is great. I think that's great. But what I really like that I heard you say is so many times I hear people say, I didn't get anything out of that.
Yeah.
So they go someplace else, you know, I didn't get anything out of that. Again, like you say, you're not supposed to get anything out of what.
Yeah. It's a side benefit that we do. The fellowship that we have, the love that we have for one another, the fact that we have classes, or a potluck today after services, or a game night, 29th at 6:30, or LTC 29th at 30th. It's a side benefit that we have, PM services at 5. It's a side benefit that we have all of that. But ultimately, our focus should be on worshiping, honoring, and glorifying God. You know? I'm not saying that those things are wrong. I'm just saying that they should not be our primary focus. It shouldn't be anything.
You're not supposed to get anything out of your lessons? Is that what you're...
If you do, it's a benefit. Well, if you...
I'm not supposed to get anything out of your lessons, or what does that mean?
Well, it's like, you have a lot of people who maybe they'll invite someone to services, and, hey, you should come hear our preacher, and I'm not saying I'm this preacher, but you should come hear our preacher, he's great, and he does this, and, you know, all of this, and he tells a bunch of stories, and, you know, we watch Andy Griffith, and whatever, right? Yeah. But really, it should be a matter of, and I'm not saying that, okay, the Andy Griffith thing is wrong, but it should be more of a statement, kind of like maybe, you know, he really kind of opens the Word. to where I understand God better. I understand me being a Christian better. It should always try to circle back away, or back to God, right? Oh, go ahead.
This morning we read Facebook. One of our mutual friends, Trey Morgan, who's a minister in Lubbock,
Oh, yeah.
Sunset, he said, saying you'll start to go to church when your life is cleaned up is like saying you'll wait to go to the ER until you stop bleeding. Church is for people whose lives are messed up, screwed up, and mixed up, like mine. I'm headed to church today because I'm weak, my life is a mess, and I'm greatly in need of a Savior. So, right there, that's how we get our benefit. We worship God, we glorify God, we get fueled up to go through the rest of our lives, rest of our week in our lives outside of church.
Yeah. And, as far, and yeah, I mean, ministers most strive to be able to provide something for the people. And it might be that, and I'm not saying, it's a blanket statement because, yeah, it's a minister, he's trying to speak to a whole group of people who are all at different age levels, different backgrounds, all of that. So some things, you might get hit right on the nose with. Other things you might say, I didn't really get that, or I didn't really understand it. A lot of the time, though, is that people, just in my experience, maybe it's not your experience, is that people don't take the sermon beyond the worship. You know what I mean? Is that they walk away and it's like, okay, I heard a good sermon, or I heard a bad sermon, whatever. But when worship is over, then it's done. They don't go back, they take notes of the verses, but they don't ever go back and read them, or try to study it for themselves and what have you. And so I would encourage it if someone were to say, I didn't get anything out of that, or it didn't make sense. Well, one, try to talk to the preacher, because there's probably something that he didn't include, just to try to make the time fit. Just let me tell you something, y'all would be here even longer, okay? I'm telling you, I'll go for 3 hours if you let me. Apparently my wife won't let me know. Oh, okay. But acceptable worship, it involves mental, emotional, and spiritual preparation. We can't just come into worship on the first day of the week, and that's all the prep that we've done. That's, basically kind of living the world, or, and I don't want to say anti-Christian, but living with the world during the week and then just being a Christian that one day of the week, right? When we look at Exodus 19, and I'll close it up here. When we look at Exodus 19, verses 10 through 15, where the people had to cleanse themselves before coming into the presence of God, the priests in Exodus 30, verses 17 through 21, they use that laver, that large basin of water, to cleanse themselves before coming into God's presence. We have to be cleansed as well. Our worship of God should affect every area of our lives. And then the book of Exodus, it closes with an emphasis on Moses and Israel's obedience to God. In chapters 39 and 40, it shows their compliance with God's pattern for the tabernacle, the furnishings, the dressings of the priests, and the phrase, "as the Lord commanded Moses," actually appears 13 times in there. So we need to have our hearts and our minds prepared. When we're taking the Lord's Supper, let every man examine himself, right? 1 Corinthians 11. So, any closing thoughts or comments? Okay, well, that's it for Class N. I appreciate the comments and your kind attention. And don't worry, we're out of Exodus now.